There is a government office somewhere that has been renewing the same land restriction order on the same canyon site for over 100 years without ever sending a single person to look at what they are restricting, not once. Just a form. Every cycle, the same form citing the previous form, signed, stamped, filed. No inspection, no photographs, no updated assessment. Just the quiet mechanical turn of an administrative lock that nobody questions because nobody is supposed to question it. And the first time I came across that paper trail, I remember sitting back in my chair and thinking, you do not do that for nothing. You do not maintain a lock for a century if there is nothing behind the door. That thought is what pulled me into this. That thought is what kept me in it for 3 years. And what I found on the other side of that door is something I am still trying to fully wrap my head around. It starts the way a lot of things start. Not with a dramatic revelation, not with someone standing up and shouting the truth. It starts with paperwork. Specifically, with a federal land classification renewal that crossed my desk while I was researching restricted access sites across highland territories in the American interior. Most of these renewals are routine. A site gets flagged for watershed protection or habitat preservation. The classification gets renewed every few years. Nobody thinks twice. But this one was different. Not because of what it said, because of what it did not say. There was no updated survey, no new environmental assessment, no reference to any inspection conducted within living memory. The renewal simply pointed to the previous renewal, which pointed to the one before that, going back in an unbroken chain to an original classification that described the site as, and I am quoting here, a natural geological formation of no significant cultural or archaeological interest. One sentence. No supporting data, no named assessor, just that one sentence, and 100 years of doors staying shut on the strength of it. I started pulling at that thread, carefully at first, the way you do when you are not sure what is on the other end. I filed public records requests. I contacted the relevant land management office. I spent weeks cross-referencing the site coordinates against historical survey maps, old expedition correspondence, county records from the period when the original classification was issued. And the further I pulled, the stranger it got. Because the original classification was not just thin, it was wrong. Provably, documentably wrong. There were witness accounts from the period that described what was in that canyon in terms that no geological formation anywhere on Earth could justify. And those accounts had not been lost. They had simply been ignored, set aside, buried under the weight of an official record that had decided in advance what the canyon contained and written everything else out of the story. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. I am not a person who looks for conspiracies. I have spent my career following evidence, and evidence is almost always boring. It is almost always ordinary. But sometimes the shape of what is missing from the record is louder than anything the record actually says, and the shape of what was missing from this canyon's official history was not subtle. It was the shape of something enormous being held very deliberately underwater. If this kind of investigation matters to you, please subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this work reach people who need to hear it. Marcus Webb was not the kind of man who spooked easily. Anyone who knew him would have told you that. He had spent the better part of his adult life working highland ranch country, the kind of terrain that has a way of sorting people out fast. The cold gets into your bones up there in a way that flat country never manages. The wind comes off the ridges sideways, and the rock underfoot shifts in ways that keep you permanently alert. Marcus was alert. He was practical. He was the last person you would expect to ride back into town with a story he could not explain. But that is exactly what happened. He came back from the canyon country one afternoon, and he was not the same man who had left that morning. The people who saw him that day said he looked like someone who had reached into a familiar coat pocket and felt something move. The slide had happened fast, the way they always do up in that kind of terrain. One moment the ridge was solid, and the next a section of cliff face. The width of a city block had simply let go, peeling away from itself in a single catastrophic movement and dropping into the canyon floor in a roar of dust and broken rock that Marcus said he felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The dust took a long time to settle. He sat his horse on the opposite ridge and waited, his eyes watering from the particulate in the air, the smell of fresh broken rock filling his lungs, that sharp mineral smell that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. And when the air finally began to clear and the exposed face of the cliff came into view, Marcus said he thought for a moment that he was not seeing what he was seeing, because what the slide had uncovered was not raw rock. It was a wall, a dressed, worked, deliberately constructed wall with 3 openings cut into it at regular intervals. Not caves, not natural hollows. Openings, rectangular, precise, the kind of geometry that only one thing in the world produces: intention. He sat there for a long moment without moving. Then he rode down. The 2 men with him went in first. Marcus followed. The interior was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the outside temperature, the kind of cold that comes from stone that has not seen air in a very long time. The walls were smooth under his hand, not worn smooth, worked smooth, and across them, in horizontal lines that ran the full width of the chamber, were markings. Not pictures, not the kind of imagery you find scratched into canyon walls by people passing through. These were geometric, regular, organized, like a system, like language. One of the men crouched down near the far wall and picked something up from the floor. He held it up toward the light coming through the doorway. It caught that light and threw it back in a way that stone does not and wood does not. Marcus could not tell what it was. He only knew it was not natural to that place. The man slipped it into his coat. They left the canyon as the last light was going. And those 2 men, the ones who walked in there with Marcus Webb, who touched the walls and pocketed something from the floor, they do not exist in any record, not a census, not a county directory, not a single document from that entire period. It is as if they were never there at all. And that is where this story stops being strange and starts being something else entirely. The man who first documented the canyon did not disappear by accident. His name was Daniel Ferris. He was a field researcher attached to a government geological survey that passed through the Highland region years before Marcus Webb ever set foot in that canyon. And the reason I know about Daniel Ferris is not because the official record mentions him. It is because the official record goes out of its way to not mention him. And that kind of absence has a particular texture to it once you learn to feel for it. I spent the better part of 6 months inside archive collections, federal correspondence files, old expedition logs, and what I found was not a story of a man who quietly retired or moved on to other work. It was a story of a name that simply stops, mid-career, mid-survey, like a sentence with no period. The expedition Ferris was part of was sent into the Highland interior to document the terrain for resource assessment. That was the stated purpose. Map the rock formations, assess the drainage patterns, identify areas suitable for future extraction operations. Standard survey work for that era. The expedition logs that survived are detailed and methodical, the kind of dry procedural writing that puts most people to sleep. But buried inside one of those logs, in a section covering a specific canyon drainage area, there is a notation that does not fit the surrounding text. Ferris writes, and I am reading from a photocopy I obtained through a records request, that the team encountered what he describes as structural anomalies of non-natural origin along the eastern face of the canyon wall. He notes the dimensions, he notes the precision of the stonework, he notes that the interior surfaces showed evidence of deliberate finishing that no geological process he was aware of could account for. And then he writes that he is preparing a separate detailed report to accompany his field notes upon return. That separate report does not exist, not in any public collection, not in any archive I was able to access. Ferris filed his notation and then vanished from the survey record entirely. No explanation, no transfer documentation, no final report. Just a name that stops appearing in the correspondence, the way a candle goes out when someone cups their hand around it. I want you to sit with that for a second. This was a trained professional, part of an official government expedition, documenting what he found with the precise, careful language of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly what the protocol for reporting it was. He followed the protocol, he flagged the find, he indicated he was preparing further documentation, and the institution that sent him into that canyon produced no record of ever receiving it. Now you could argue that paperwork gets lost, files go missing. Record-keeping from that era was imperfect. I would agree with all of that under normal circumstances. But Daniel Ferris is not a single data point. He is part of a pattern, and the pattern is what changes everything. Because here is what I found when I stopped looking at Ferris in isolation and started mapping the broader survey correspondence from that same period. There were at least 4 other instances in that same expedition record where a field note referencing an anomalous find was followed by a gap, not a normal gap. A structural gap. The kind where a reference to a forthcoming document exists, but the document itself does not. 4 times in a single expedition record. 4 times a researcher flagged something that did not fit the accepted picture of what that territory was supposed to contain. And 4 times the follow-up simply did not arrive. The expedition's published summary, the one that circulated to government offices and eventually became part of the official historical record of the region, contains none of it. Not a word. It reads as a clean, unremarkable survey of unremarkable terrain, which means someone made a decision about what that summary would and would not include. And that decision was made before Marcus Webb was even born. Now the story moves back forward in time. Back to the canyon, back to the slide, back to the 2 paragraphs that appeared in a regional paper a few weeks after Marcus came down from that ridge looking like a man who had touched something he could not unfeel. Those 2 paragraphs are the only public acknowledgement that anything unusual was ever found in that canyon. 2 paragraphs in a small regional paper describing what local people were calling carved workings in the exposed cliff face. No photographs, no follow-up. The story ran once, and then the paper moved on to cattle prices and road conditions and the kind of news that keeps a community oriented toward the practical business of daily life. I read those 2 paragraphs probably 30 times before I noticed the thing that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The editor of that paper also served on the county land committee, the same land committee that was in the middle of classifying which sections of the canyon territory would be available for mineral extraction and which would not. The same canyon territory, the same classification process, the same window of time, and the story ran once and then it stopped. Now I am not saying the editor made a phone call and killed the story as a personal favor to someone. I am saying the shape of that situation is recognizable. When a person has 2 roles, and those 2 roles point in opposite directions, the role connected to money and land and political access tends to win. It almost always tends to win. And the result in this case was a 2-paragraph acknowledgement of something that deserved a great deal more, followed by silence. The same silence that swallowed Daniel Ferris. The same silence that has been administratively renewed every few years for over a century. But here is the thing about silence. It is not neutral. Silence has weight. And the weight of this particular silence was about to get a lot heavier. The Federal Bureau sent agents to the canyon site, and those agents filed a report that is exactly 2 sentences long. 2 sentences to cover a site that multiple civilian witnesses described in terms that would fill pages. I have held a photocopy of that report in my hands, and I want to tell you what it feels like to read something that short about something that significant. It feels like opening a book and finding that someone has carefully removed every page except the cover and the last line. It feels deliberate in a way that an accident never does. The report states that a field inspection of the canyon drainage area was conducted and that no findings of cultural or archaeological significance were produced. That is it. No date of inspection. No name of the agent who conducted it. No description of methodology, no photographs, no measurements, no reference to the civilian accounts that had already been circulating in the region for weeks before the agents ever arrived. I want to walk you through what an actual field assessment of an anomalous site looks like, because the contrast matters. A proper assessment involves documentation of the exterior approach, measurements of any structural openings, photographic records from multiple angles, interior survey notes, material sampling where applicable, and a written assessment signed by the responsible agent. That process takes days for a site of any meaningful size. What the Bureau filed took, by my estimate, about 4 minutes to write. And the reason that matters is not just that the report is thin. It is that the report is thin in a very specific way. It is thin in exactly the places where the civilian testimony was detailed. Marcus Webb described the dimensions of the openings. The Bureau report contains no dimensions. The physician who examined the men who came back from the canyon compared the stonework to a known dressed stone building in the region. The Bureau report contains no reference to stonework at all. Every specific thing that the witnesses described is absent from the official assessment. That is not incompetence. Incompetence produces random gaps. This produced targeted ones. And then I found something that shifted the entire picture. Because this was not the first time this Bureau had produced a report like this. I cross-referenced the filing style, the language, the structural absence of named agents and supporting documentation against other Bureau reports from the same era covering sites in different regions. I found 11 other instances, 11 other locations where a civilian discovery of something anomalous was followed by a brief official assessment with no supporting data, no named assessors, and a conclusion that nothing of significance was present. 11 times across different territories, different terrain, different decades, the same document appeared wearing different clothes, the same two-sentence architecture, the same careful erasure of every specific detail the witnesses had provided. At that point, you are no longer looking at a pattern of negligence. You are looking at a procedure. A practiced, refined, institutional procedure for converting something into nothing on paper. And the Canyon site had been run through that procedure so cleanly that for over a century, the official record contained exactly what the procedure was designed to produce. A single unremarkable notation that pointed nowhere and invited no further questions. So at that point, I go back to Marcus Webb, back to the two men who walked into the chamber with him and then dissolved out of every record that should have contained them. I told you earlier that those men do not appear in any census, any county directory, any document from that entire period that I could locate. And I want to be precise about what that absence means in practical terms. The region Marcus was working in was sparsely populated. That actually makes the absence more striking, not less. In a densely populated area, a person can move through without leaving much of a mark. In a small highland territory where every resident, every ranch hand, every traveling worker tended to show up in at least one document, two adult men who spent enough time in the area to be riding the canyon country with a local rancher should have left some trace. A boarding house record, a supply purchase, a name on a work roster, something. There is nothing. And the more I sat with that nothing, the more one explanation kept rising to the surface. What if those men were not ranchers passing through? What if they were already there because they were supposed to be there? What if the Bureau's procedure did not begin after the discovery was reported? What if it began before? Because here is the thing about the reflective fragment that one of them put in his coat pocket and never produced again. Marcus Webb noted it in his account. He described it with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was seeing was significant. And then it was gone. Taken by a man whose name was not real, whose presence in that canyon has no legitimate explanation, and who walked back into the landscape and simply ceased to exist in any record. That fragment, whatever it was, never surfaced in any collection, never appeared in any catalog, never showed up in any correspondence as a received specimen. It went into that coat pocket, and it went somewhere that the official record has never acknowledged. And the question of where that somewhere is, and who decided that the public would never be allowed to know about it, is the question that leads directly to the most disturbing part of this entire story. A private journal kept by a doctor's wife cracked this case open wider than anything I found in any official archive. Her name was Clara Hendricks. She was not a researcher. She was not an investigator. She was a woman who wrote in her journal every evening the way some people breathe, automatically, consistently, without drama. And that is exactly what makes what she wrote so difficult to dismiss. Clara had no reason to fabricate. She had no audience. She was writing for herself, in the kind of plain, careful language that people use when they are simply recording what happened rather than trying to make something sound more interesting than it was. Her journal was donated to a regional historical society decades after her passing by a family member who thought it might be of local historical interest. And for a long time it sat in a catalog, listed, accessible, unremarkable, until I requested it. The entry I am about to describe to you comes from several weeks after Marcus Webb came down from that canyon ridge. Clara writes that her husband was called out on an unusual evening visit to examine several men who had returned from the canyon country in a state that she describes as severe agitation. Not her husband's words, her words. She was a precise writer, and she chose that phrase deliberately. Severe agitation. She notes that when her husband attempted to examine them, two of the men were cooperative but visibly distressed, struggling to articulate what they had experienced. The third man refused to be examined at all. He sat in the corner of the room with his back to the wall and would not speak beyond single-word answers. Clara's husband, who had spent years treating people in a working Highland community and had seen his share of accidents and shocks, told her that evening that he had never seen that particular quality of distress before. It was not the distress of injury. It was not the distress of grief. It was the distress, he said, of men who had looked at something that their minds could not find a category for. And then there is the name. Among the men her husband treated that evening, Clara records a surname. Hendricks does not give first names for all of them, only partial identifiers, the way you write about people you expect yourself to remember without full annotation. But one of the surnames she records is the same unusual surname that appeared in Marcus Webb's account as one of his two companions in the canyon. An uncommon name in a sparsely populated region in the same season around the same event. The probability of that being coincidence is something I spent a long time trying to honestly calculate. I could not get there. The name connects the man in Clara's journal entry to the man who walked into the canyon with Marcus and then vanished from every official record. Which means at least one of Marcus's companions was not a ghost after all. He was a real person who came back from that canyon in a state that a physician found genuinely alarming and who then, at some point after that evening, stopped appearing in any document that has survived. And now the journal itself is unavailable, listed in the catalog, physically present in the collection, but unavailable for examination due to conservation concerns that have apparently persisted for years without resolution. I want you to think about what a document has to contain for conservation concerns to last that long. Books and papers from that era are examined by researchers every single day in historical societies across the country. The conservation concern that never resolves is not a conservation concern. It is a door with a lock on it, and we are back to locked doors again. The physical evidence from the canyon is what the official record has worked hardest to neutralize, and I want to take that apart piece by piece because it is where the suppression machinery shows its clearest seams. The chambers Marcus Webb described were not small. The openings he entered were tall enough that a man of ordinary height standing inside them would have had a substantial amount of space above his head. The walls were smooth in a way that surrounding natural rock was not, and the markings were not random. They ran in organized horizontal rows across the interior stone face, with a regularity that Marcus himself noted felt like something written rather than something carved for decoration. Now the official geological explanation for all of this is that what the slide exposed were natural solution cavities, enlarged hollows formed by water moving through rock over a very long period of time, misread by untrained observers who lacked the geological knowledge to interpret what they were seeing correctly. I want to be fair to that explanation. I want to steelman it, but I cannot, because the physical reality of what solution cavities actually look like makes the explanation impossible. Water moving through granite does not produce rectangular openings. It does not produce flat floors. It does not produce right-angled walls. It does not produce smooth interior surfaces of consistent finish. And it absolutely does not produce organized horizontal rows of geometric markings on those surfaces. Not once in the geological literature is there a documented case of natural water erosion producing anything that resembles what multiple witnesses described seeing in that canyon. The official explanation does not just strain credibility, it contradicts the basic physical behavior of water moving through stone. And here is the detail that makes the official explanation not just wrong, but specifically dishonest. The geological classification was issued before any interior survey was conducted. By the time the Bureau filed its two-sentence report, the slide debris had already substantially blocked the original openings. The agents who arrived at that site could not have conducted an interior assessment even if they had wanted to. They classified the interior of a space they had not entered. They declared it natural based on observations they could not have made. And that classification has been cited as the authoritative basis for every subsequent renewal of the access restriction. 100 years of locked doors, built on a foundation of an assessment that was physically impossible to have conducted. The people who buried this canyon had names, they had offices, they had financial interests so specific and so documented that once you lay them out side by side with the timeline of the suppression, the coincidence argument simply collapses under its own weight. I have been careful throughout this investigation not to reach further than the evidence allows. But the evidence in this section does not require any reaching at all. It requires only that you look at who needed that canyon to stay quiet, and when they needed it, and then compare that to exactly when the quiet was enforced. The canyon territory was valuable, not for what was inside those chambers, for what was in the rock surrounding them. The geological strata of that highland corridor contained mineral deposits that extraction operations had been eyeing for years before the slide ever happened. The process of formally classifying which sections of that territory would be open for commercial extraction and which would be held back was already underway when Marcus Webb rode down from that ridge. That classification process was being managed by a small number of territorial officials, and those officials had direct relationships with the commercial interests that stood to benefit from the outcome, not distant relationships, direct ones. Correspondence between the chief engineer of the primary extraction operation expanding through the region and the territorial administration from that exact period references the canyon corridor repeatedly. The language is careful. It is the language of men who understood that what they were writing might one day be read by someone other than the intended recipient. But the meaning is not subtle. The engineer writes about the importance of maintaining what he calls a clean developmental pathway through the canyon territory. He writes about the need to avoid complications that would delay the classification timeline. He writes these things in letters sent during the precise months when the official assessment of the canyon site was being finalized, and the site was classified as a natural geological formation of no significance. Clean, on schedule, no complications. Now I want to be precise here, because precision is what separates an investigation from a theory. I am not saying those men sat in a room and explicitly ordered the suppression of an archaeological discovery. I am saying that every person with decision-making authority over the classification of that site had a clear financial reason to reach the conclusion that was reached. I am saying that the outcome they needed and the outcome that was produced were identical. And I am saying that the procedure used to produce that outcome, the two-sentence report, the unnamed agents, the absence of interior survey, was already a practiced institutional tool that had been applied at least 11 times before in similar circumstances. You do not need to prove a meeting happened. You only need to show that the room was already tilted in one direction before anyone sat down. And in this case, the tilt was not subtle. It was the kind of tilt that sends everything sliding toward the same corner every single time, regardless of what the evidence on the table actually says. What I have not yet told you about is the bones. And this is the part of the investigation where everything that came before suddenly snaps into a different focus, because the canyon chambers did not exist in isolation. They existed as part of a broader picture that was assembling itself across multiple highland and valley regions during the same era. And that picture, when you see it whole, is the thing that explains why the suppression was not just local and not just about mineral rights. During the same general period that the canyon discovery was being quietly buried, a wave of reported finds was moving through regional newspapers, county records, and personal correspondence across a wide stretch of interior American territory. Physicians, engineers, farmers, and local officials were documenting the discovery of skeletal remains that did not correspond to normal human proportions. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the claims in these accounts are significant, and I am not in the business of overstating what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is this. Named individuals with professional standing and no obvious reason to fabricate filed accounts describing remains that were dramatically larger than standard human dimensions. Not slightly larger, not within the range of natural variation, dramatically larger. Remains that a physician might note with genuine clinical surprise, the kind that makes you put down your pen and look again. These accounts were not fringe material at the time they were published. They appeared in the same papers that covered local elections and weather and the price of grain. They were written by the kind of people whose word was considered reliable in their communities. And then, over the following decades, they vanished. The specimens that had been collected and sent to the federal institution were received, cataloged in internal records, and never publicly displayed. The newspaper archives that contained the original reports became progressively harder to access. The official archaeological record that was being constructed during the same period made no reference to any of it. And the chamber dimensions that Marcus Webb described, openings tall enough and wide enough to suggest occupants of a scale that modern human beings are not, align with what those accounts were describing. The architecture and the remains point toward the same conclusion, and that conclusion is the thing that the official record has been most precisely engineered to prevent anyone from reaching. The canyon is still there. The restriction is still active. And this is where I want to slow down, because I think the final piece of this story is the most important one, and I do not want to rush past it. Every few years, a federal land management office files a renewal of the access restriction on that canyon site. The renewal cites the previous renewal. The previous renewal cited the one before it, all the way back to the original two-sentence classification that was issued without an interior survey by unnamed agents on behalf of interests that needed the canyon to stay clean. That is the chain. Each link in it looks routine. Each link points to the one before it as its justification. No single person renewing that classification has to know the full history of what they are renewing. They only have to sign the form that references the previous form. The system does not require anyone to actively lie. It only requires that no one ask the question that breaks the chain. What exactly are we protecting in there? And why have we never looked? I have been sitting with this investigation for 3 years. I have read the field notes and the archive correspondence and the 2-sentence reports and the journal entries and the land classification documents. I have traced the names that stop and the records that disappear and the conservation concerns that never resolve. And the conclusion I keep arriving at is not comfortable, but it is simple. The history we have been given about what existed in this landscape before us is not a complete history. It is a managed one. It was managed by institutions that understood, clearly and early, that certain discoveries would complicate the story they needed to tell. And the tool they used to manage it was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was paperwork. It was the slow accumulation of official documents that point to each other in a circle and never let anyone in or out. The canyon has been held underwater not by force, but by form, not by destruction, but by administration. And the thing about water is that it always finds the pressure points eventually. The documents survived, Clara Hendricks wrote in her journal. Daniel Ferris filed his notation. Marcus Webb told someone what he saw. The chain of official silence is only as strong as the assumption that nobody will pull hard enough on the individual links. I pulled, and what I felt on the other end did not feel like nothing. So here is the question I want to leave with you. If the official record was built to tell a specific story, and the tools used to build it are documented, and the financial interests that needed that story are named and traceable, then what else in the history you were taught was assembled the same way, in a different canyon, by different men, for the same reason? Think about that. And then tell me in the comments what you think is still locked away, because I do not think this canyon is the only door. If this investigation made you think, please leave a like and subscribe. It is the only way this kind of work reaches the people who need to hear it, and there is a great deal more still to uncover.